Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Everyone makes mistakes in chess, even though we tried not to. Some are easier to avoid than others, but every player is going to make mistakes. Today we're going to be looking at the top 8 mistakes that chess players make. Especially, you're going to see these a lot more with beginner players. More experienced players tend to try to avoid these as much as possible. But without further ado, the top 8 chess mistakes that players make. The first mistake a lot of players make is to bring out their queen way too early in the match. They recognize that the queen is the most powerful piece, so they play pawn e4, pawn e5, and then immediately bring their queen out to h5, hoping that their opponent makes a mistake. You know, they could play knight here to f6, attacking the queen, and then all of a sudden queen here to e5, gobble up some material, and then check the king. The problem is if your opponent has any sense of what you're doing, they just start developing their other pieces correctly. Knight to c6, great development move, center of the board, controlling this square here. Then we see bishop here to c4, trying to trap the opponent with the queen here to f7. But then all of a sudden, pawn to g6. Then the queen comes back here to f3 because still want to try to trap your opponent here on f7. And then knight to f6. All of a sudden, black is developing his board very, very easily. White, on the other hand, is just trying to bring his queen everywhere, and this queen is now blocking the knight from getting involved. So whenever you're playing, try not to bring your queen out very early unless you have a really, really good reason to. And more times than not, you're not going to have a good reason. The next mistake I see a lot is players not focusing on the center of the board. Pawn e4, pawn a5, knight f3, and then pawn to h5. This is an extreme example, but you can see black is not even trying to focus on the center of the board. You always want to try to control the center. That's where everything stems from. So you're just going to have a much easier time if you focus on the center. Don't try from the wings. You definitely can try to control with your minor pieces, but don't start moving your pawns on the edge of the board early on. It's going to be very, very bad for you. The next mistake players make is forgetting to castle. Now, castling does a few things. One, it keeps you from having your king in the center of the board, just getting chased around everywhere. But it gives your king safety. It also gets one of your major pieces involved into the action. The rook, they're very powerful, but they start on the corners of the board, and you have to try to get them involved into the game, or they just kind of sit there and they don't do any good for you. So castling not only protects you, but gets your rook involved into the game a little quicker. So make sure that for the most part you're always castling. Again, there are a few rare exceptions, but best practice, especially if you're a beginner, always castle. Another huge mistake people make is not protecting their king. The pawns in front of your king are very, very valuable. It's okay to make some moves like pawn here to h3. This kind of stops some of the points like the knight coming here to g4. That's completely okay, but you can take this too far. Some players, let's say bishop here to e7, they'll start to push forward. Pawn here to g4, castle on the king's side, pawn up here to g5. They really want to force this knight to move, but it's come at the expense of all of the safety in front of this king. The white king, it's in the corner and it has no defense. Eventually it will fall. So make sure that you treat the pawns in front of your king with the utmost importance. They are really there to protect your king at all costs. So make sure, again, if you lose your king, you lose the game. So make sure you protect your king. The next mistake I see a lot of people make is not thinking about their opponent's plan. You should always have a plan when you play, but it's equally important to think about what your opponent's trying to do. Look at this board state. If queen plays queen here to h4, a couple things happening. One, this queen is threatening this pawn here on h2 for check, has protection from the bishop here. Queen can immediately take here on h4. If white's not careful, white may think this is a blunder by the queen on h4, but white has to keep in mind that black's plan is really to have all the focus look over here, because this queen is actually protecting the square here on b1. If white comes over here and takes on h4, all of a sudden white's going to lose with rook here to b1. Again, this is a very simple example, but always think about what your opponent's trying to do and not just be tunnel vision on what you're trying to do. It'll definitely improve your game a lot. Another mistake a lot of players make is moving their minor pieces more than once in the beginning without any reason. Now, sometimes you may move that piece because you're capturing a piece or because you're setting up a trap, and it's going to end up being good for you. But sometimes players just move their pieces over and over without any rhyme or reason. So you may play pawn here to d3, knight f6, moving your knight up here to g5. There's no rhyme or reason right now. You're not trying to set up an attack. You don't have any other pieces attacking. Pawn here to f7, bishop here to e7, knight involved, pawn moving the knight back here to f3, castle, the knight comes back here to d2, just kind of moving your knight around. This is definitely going to be bad. You can see black has a much better position here than white. White's just kind of moving all of his knights around, doesn't have any of his other pieces developed, is a couple moves away. Right now it's 3 moves away from actually castling his king, getting king safety. So black has the upper hand where white kind of started in the game. So make sure you move your pieces towards the center of the board you control, but then don't move them again unless you have a very good reason to. Another big mistake that beginners make is taking a easily won in-game and turning it into a stalemate or a draw. And it may look like this. White obviously ahead, we can all tell, going to be an easy in-game, but because they rush things, all of a sudden queen to f5, kind of forcing the king into a corner, which is exactly what white needs to do here. The king's going to come here to h8, and then king to f8. And unfortunately, this is a drawn game. Black is not in check, and he can no longer move, and so this is going to be a draw game. White does not win this, so need to be a little bit more careful as far as how white plays. You don't always have to check your opponent, but make sure that if he's not in check, he does have a square or a move that he can make, so you don't end up with a stalemate, because this is very, very frustrating. The last mistake I see players make is to fall for traps. Now, traps are always fun to play, especially if you're laying the trap, but beginners, they're just not familiar with them. Now, we've all kind of tried the basic ones, the pawn to e4, pawn e5, get your queen involved into the game, and then after knight to c7 or knight to c6, get your bishop involved, and then just hope and pray that they play something on the queen side so you can come down here, queen to f7, checkmate, you win very, very quickly, the game is over. But a lot of times they're a lot more subtle. Pawn e4, pawn e5, we get into the Berlin defense, and then all of a sudden your opponent plays something really weird. They play knight to g4, and then you play pawn to h3, trying to just kick their knight back because this looks kind of weird, and they play pawn to h5. You take their knight and kind of chuckle, and then they play pawn to g4, and you essentially lose the game. And you're just like, man, I just don't understand what happened. Their queen come here to h4 after they move your knight, and then you're just going to lose. And so you look at this like the fishing pole trap here and say, man, this is a tough way to go. So always important to be familiar with some of the traps. One, because they're fun to play yourself, but then two, you just don't want to fall for them. And usually, if you can stop the trap, you will end up with a better game. So always want to make sure there are a lot of videos on the website, thechesswebsite.com, to look at some of those traps, but make sure you're familiar with them. You definitely don't want to be falling for some of these traps. So again, these are the top 8 mistakes I see from chess players that they make in their own games, especially beginners. So make sure you try to avoid these, and if you see your opponents playing these, hopefully you can take advantage and win a lot more games. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.